I am really pleased to have this opportunity to welcome Mr. Doug Morgan, General Manager, the City of Calgary Transportation, to this keynote presentation. Before I turn it to Doug for his great presentation that is about to follow, I do want to give a little bit of a context. QTRIC has had a long time association with Calgary Transit, and we have had discussions with the Calgary Transit about fuel cell deployments starting in 2016. And we are actually working along with Calgary Transit on assessing empirically what the potential of treating compressed natural gas vehicles to be treated as zero emission vehicles with the RNG in the pipeline. Thank you so much to Calgary Transit for your continued collaboration. We have also funded a social media analytics project with Calgary Transit and UFT to analyze Calgary's social media feed, which has helped establish a software program that QTRIC is looking forward to expand with other transit agencies as well. So I do want to invite Doug to talk about what Calgary Transit's situation is in terms of planning the electrification that the transit agency has, whether it be battery electric, hydrogen, and or CNG with RNG in the pipeline. I'm envisioning that Doug would also talk about how has the pandemic affected it all in terms of ridership and what the return on investment may be looking like in light of the pandemic and reduced riderships. With that, Doug, I do want to turn to you and welcome you to this keynote presentation. The stage is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Parnathi. Hopefully you can hear me out there. Great to be here. This picture actually it could be live today with a nice sunny day here in Calgary. It's a shame to be inside, but great to be with you and talking a bit about the trials and tribulations at the end of a pandemic for Calgary Transit. So let's go to the next slide. There we go. I thought I'd chat with you today just a little bit about the challenges we face. And you've probably heard a little bit of this from other transit agencies across Canada, but Calgary has some other challenges that we're facing. So I thought I'd share a few of those with you and then talk about our focused response, how we see climbing out of post-pandemic, but some other things that we're facing alongside of the pandemic impact. Next slide. So talk a bit about Calgary Transit. We are a fairly large property in Southern Alberta. We have a combination of LRT, bus, and paratransit services. We serve in the good times in 2019 over 100 million trips per year. So we have about 500 to 600,000 boardings per day. We spend quite a bit of money at 470 million in operating. Our revenue cost ratio is around 43%. So that's dropping with some of our equity initiatives going on and just more investment in the community and support from council. We do operate a fairly simple system with a single fare zone. In order to provide all that service, we have over 1,000 buses and 220 light rail vehicles. And for the fueling folks out there, 18 million liters of diesel fuel per year. We have come off our peak diesel fuel usage, which at the peak of the peak was probably about 25 million liters of fuel, which is quite a number. Next slide. So talk a little bit about our current operations and the fun we're having with the pandemic. And you'll probably see a very similar graph for the agencies across Canada. The left side here being over the years, we were fairly healthy. We're actually starting to see some of our ridership come back in 2018 and 2019 before the pandemic hit. On the right, you see the ridership as it has been over the last year and a half and ranging from a low of around 15% to coming up around 40%. So really a tough time for us as far as service and ridership, and those revenues we rely on are significantly impacted by the current pandemic. Next slide. But there's other challenges we face as well. So as we've seen the ridership drop in Calgary, we've also seen some changes in behavior on our system. So we did see our regular volumes decrease on our LRT system we saw a lot of the areas, the public areas in the downtown closed to the public. And what we found is growing disorder on our system, which had an impact of people's perception of safety on transit. They were already gun shy because of COVID, but then it was starting to erode our reputation. We have currently 100 peace officers that look after our system. They were stretched thin at 50 kilometers of rail with 50 stations. Very difficult to be everywhere at all points in time, and really a concentration with the folks on the system not being able to go anywhere else and not flooded by regular riders, that it became a public concern. So we're currently dealing with this challenge today. Next slide. The second challenge, and it's related to fueling in some ways, is really the structural changes going on in downtown employment in Calgary in the oil and gas industry. And we're going through a bit of a transformation in the downtown in changing industry and changing employment. So we have seen our downtown office occupancy hover around 28 to 29% of vacancy, which has a significant impact on a transit system that focused to serve the peaks in the downtown. We saw just before the pandemic those trends starting to reverse, but once it hit, we did see quite an impact on our downtown ridership, and we see that continuing today. So that's another challenge we face. Next slide. The other challenge, and it's a bit of a good news, bad news piece of information, and it's really the penetration we're seeing, and it's exciting, and that's in the low carbon auto market. We're starting to see that take up finally the behavioral change. I know I've got 3 or 4 neighbors on my street that drive Teslas, which is great, but what it also does is it starts to weaken transit's value proposition when it comes to the environmental impacts of our service. So as we see more cars switching over to alternate fuels with low emissions, the business case for riding the bus being the green alternative, especially if you've got diesel buses, starting to erode. So we're having to shift our focus on broaden our value proposition beyond just the environment to both economic, environmental, social, strengthen those business cases beyond just the environment. So good news at times, but also bad news, and could lead us to the weird outcome where we actually have more congestion, but less pollution, which could be just as damaging to the way a city operates. Next slide. So now the question posed to us, how do we respond to this? How do we recover? What does transit of the future look like? So I'm going to talk a bit about our recovery, the mechanics of the recovery, but also some strategic plays in the long run about social equity, about driving service efficiency and operational efficiency to rise to those challenges that we saw on the previous slides. Next slide. So this first one is really our service response. So the red line is one you saw on the previous slide around ridership being at the 10 to 20% level. But what didn't happen is a reduction in service. So as we saw those public distancing guidelines go in, we actually did not reduce our service all that much. So we got to about 80 to 85% of service, fairly over-serviced for our regular load targets. But what that did is put some fairly significant financial challenges on the operations. And it really will, as we look at the trends into the future, into 2022, we see that gap narrowing, but it's still on the horizon. So we're looking at investments in the short term to really ensure that our service leads that recovery. The last thing we want to do as we invite folks back into the service to have overloads and a poor customer experience. So we're really concentrating on what that stepwise recovery looks like and making sure we lead it without getting too far out in front and emptying our bank account, so to speak. So that's our first strategy, is to really put that stepwise scalable reintroduction of service to serve Calgarians. Next slide. We're also doing some fairly significant things in our downtown, and this is to help us pivot life and times of our downtown. So we've created a $200 million downtown strategy, which means changing what our downtown is to our community. That means making downtown the place for activity, being a bigger magnet for people to come in from the suburbs into downtown, driving downtown business success, doing some conversions on commercial properties to allow more people to live downtown. We just opened a fairly large parkade that is convertible. So part of it is an innovation center, part of it is parking, and we have the ability to convert that into to living or office space as our parking demand changes over time. And the fourth one is really transit focused, and it's connecting downtown. It's how do we get people in and out through transit. Part of our investments in LRT and BRT will help support that. So really evolving what our downtown is to our city. No longer is it the peak hour mecca. It is really meant to be a place where we can live, work, and play. There's also major investments going on, like the BMO Convention Center, a major expansion. There's our new arena we call the Event Center. That's a $500 million investment very close by to the Convention Center, and also an evolution of our Arts Commons area. So really putting places in the downtown that will attract not only folks living around the area, but also Calgarians from across the city, which is going to necessitate, again, driving that good transit capacity we have to support the downtown. Next slide. Talk a bit about our strategy when it comes to equity. And we've been working on equity for some years now, and we have what's called our low income transit pass, which is fully integrated into what we call our fair entry program. It provides deeply discounted access to transit for not only regular transit users, but also seniors, where we reduce the barriers of income to our services. And we've been working on this in conjunction with other fee assistance programs like recreation, property tax assistance, and seniors home maintenance, and made it really customer focused on the fair entry for them to get access to these programs. We provide counseling at the same time, and really look at the transit service and affordable transit as providing access to Calgarians to the activities that they need, whether it be work, play, or socializing, and really drive that business case for transit when it comes to equity. And we saw a little bit of this during the pandemic, where transit was almost seen as an essential service that could not be taken away, because it was the only way these folks in need were able to get around the city and be able to have access to jobs in critical parts of their lives. Next slide. Just some stats on how this has grown over time. As I said, we started this way back in 2005, and we've seen a significant take up to the point of up to 60,000 passes sold a month. So a real good portion of our riders are having a look at this, and the prices go as low as $5 per month to have access to all parts of the city through all parts of the day. And really, it's a strategic part of our service that drives the value proposition of transit. Next slide. Talk a bit about just driving efficiency and different service provision. We've been piloting what we call On Demand, which is a much smaller vehicle out on our system to respond to low ridership areas at the edges of our time periods, or in new communities that are just starting up. And this helps us scale our expenditures, yet support and introduce transit service sooner. So rather than having a 40-foot bus or even a 30-foot bus in communities on a fixed service, we would actually have this more almost like a taxi, shared ride taxi, where folks can pick it up in their community and we would bring them back to our line haul routes. So again, trying to drive that cost per customer down so we can support that equity goal we had, but also ensuring that transit can have the greatest coverage with the least amount of cost. Next slide. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, we're also making some significant investments in larger infrastructure. We've just opened our 70 kilometers of the MAX rapid transit lines, which are 4 lines, about $300 million investment, better customer amenities, transit priority, and really fill in the web between our LRT lines. And what we found actually is that this has performed better during the pandemic, more resilient because it connected up different places. All the hospitals lie on the MAX network, schools, grocery stores, and we found it was more resilient in terms of ridership than our LRT system. But that doesn't mean we've stopped our investments in LRT. We have a $5 billion project in the Green Line, which is 20 kilometers of new low-floor LRT, again, to connect through the downtown to the other lines, which seeks to service 65,000 customers. And again, we're trying to invest in areas where we can be competitive, where we have demands that support an LRT using mode progression in order to, again, lower our cost per trip and really operate in areas where we can be competitive. Next slide. Now, again, shifting gears on service, we also see some collaboration. So we can amplify the use of those modes like LRT and BRT by solving the first mile and last mile problem. Things like car share. So Communauto came into our market in August of 2020. We just introduced 2 new providers of e-scooters who will also provide bike share as well. And these seek to extend the reach of transit, to lower our costs for those first mile, last mile services, and really connect in. And our goal here is really to attract folks to a car-free lifestyle where they use transit some days, scooters, mobility, and really our vision is to move towards that mobility as a service. So a Calgarian can just effortlessly through technology hire the type of mode that they need at that point in time and be really flexible. Next slide. Now shifting gears a little bit to talk again about efficiency, but to focus a bit on fueling given the nature of the conference, and to chat with you just a bit about us running in several swim lanes at the same time in order to provide the best value as far as service provision. Next slide. You might have heard that we have opened the largest natural gas facility in North America. This came from a long-term strategy that started way back in 2013 with the piloting of 4 natural gas vehicles into our bus fleet. That led to a natural gas strategy, which included a new $174 million CNG bus maintenance facility. It is fed by a high-pressure CNG line right into the facility. It allows us eventually to fuel over 420 buses at the same time frame for fueling as for diesel buses. So very efficient and really have provided us, I guess I would call it our short to medium term fueling strategy. And that's really allowed us to lower costs significantly and pay those buses back in 3 to 5 years. So a really cost-effective solution that matched with some of the city priorities, and also is our first step to moving off diesel towards alternative fuels. Next slide. And here it gives you an idea. We're currently running about 114 buses with an additional 25 on order. We do see some significant cost savings with 50% less than the diesel buses. We're seeing better performance as mean distance between failure is much better on a CNG bus, as well as the ongoing maintenance cost. And so we've seen quite a bit of success. The buses are quite a bit quieter, so the customer experience is better, and just been a real success. You might notice on a couple of these charts, there's big gaps in the red in the use of our CNG buses. That was when we actually had to close some of our facilities due to COVID and lower service provision. So they're meant to be there, and we're happy to see those coming back online and us improving our CNG deployment. The other thing I might add is and the range is excellent. Over 760 kilometers in range for these CNG buses, and reliability is one of our key customer commitments. And the fuel savings is about 1/3 the cost of diesel. Next slide. our next steps is really now, how do we evolve our use of CNG towards RNG? And I was just chatting with some of our actual landfill and water treatment folks about the effluent of their processes and the potential to generate natural gas from that process. So one of our challenges is the supply of renewable natural gas and the cost. So if we can do that through some of our municipal operations, it's a real opportunity for us to be creative and really drive long-term value, not only from our transit operations, but some of the other activities that we're involved in. We do see real environmental benefits of the RNG, of perhaps a negative environmental impact being that we're actually reducing overall through the use of transit greenhouse gases. So those kind of investments and explorations we really think are going to be part of our future and the bundling of our services we provide to Calgarians. Next slide. We are also looking at zero emission technology when it comes to battery electric pilot. So we know there's lots of our partners across the industry that are testing 40-foot buses. We have a fairly extensive fleet of smaller, what we call community shuttles that go on community routes that have lower ridership. So this trial is meant to evaluate those 30-foot buses with the potential conversion to electric buses. And those will be arriving early in 2022. I think we just announced the procurement last week. They are part of a program from Emissions Reduction Alberta that we're afforded that funding as a pilot in technology as part of the BEST program. Next slide. We also see the potential of hydrogen fuel cell. We've seen a significant investment from the government of Alberta to put together over 15 million to the complex, which is expected to create over 2,500 jobs and provide enough liquid hydrogen to fuel every transit agency across the province. We think this is a real opportunity to start to harness that hydrogen technology and again, broaden the use of energy in our vehicles and look for creativity and innovation in fueling technology. Next slide. So to sum up, we're really focused on not only that evolution in fueling technology, cost effectiveness, environmental impact, but how it fits within our overall transit strategy. How can we drive that equity? How do we evolve our business case to show that clean fueling technology is part of our overall business case, but there's other drivers to our business than just that, and that we can slowly dovetail this whole strategy into transit for the future to help communities continue to evolve, and that transit is a key part of the success in Calgary. So that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Doug. That was a very informative presentation. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I wanted to thank you. That was such an insightful presentation, very informative. Thank you for sharing. We do have several questions from our audience, but I do want to start with an aspect that you highlighted, particularly having the several swim lanes approach. And I did notice you are highlighting a different zero emission solutions and potentially an optimized model involving different solutions is under development at Calgary. So I do want to learn more. When you say you have CNG, RNG fleet, so I know that you have an operational CNG fleet, which you are planning to transition to RNG or a mix of CNG and RNG, depending on the fuel availability. Am I to infer that you are planning an implementation plan for zero emission buses at Calgary Transit involving a mix of hydrogen fuel cell buses and battery electric buses, and leave out the challenging blocks or vehicles that cannot be electrified using either of those technologies for CNG with RNG? Is that the plan or anything more?
You did that. Yeah. I think you hit it right on the head. It's really that flexibility to have the right tool in the right spot. And we see things like when we look at our electronic or electric bus strategy, that perhaps there's some en route charging we can do for a service between the airport and the downtown where there's a lot of dwell times. So trying to fit the application of the fueling technology with the service together. Other routes where we have a bus that's out 25 hours a day, we're thinking, is there a better technology solution that might be CNG and RNG, and mix those together? So trying to chart that course, and we really call it a transition. We think everyone's future is going to be electric. It's what that technology looks like and how we step into it. With all the legacy investment we have, it will also be a staged redeployment, and how quickly we move is part of the business case. Also, as costs start to change between some of the electric technologies, some of the charging technologies, that's when we say moving in that direction. Right now, the investments we've made in CNG make the incremental cost very attractive. We get payback on the additional cost for the bus very quickly, and then we start to realize those savings to pour back into our operations. And when it comes to RNG, it's really having a stable fuel supply that we can really run those buses and generate those kind of economic benefits sustainably over time. So be really flexible in our deployment.
Yeah, so that is great. So, I mean, the complementary solution is something that we would need to go forward with. But I just want to like add a sub question to that query, because most often when we talk about complementary solutions, combining two technology options, the transit agencies would be like worried that there would be too much training and learning involved, because transitioning from diesel to one mode of zero emission is in itself like a long term journey and a lot of learning and investment. How are you planning to navigate that transition involving multiple modes of zero emission, which is great, but what are those challenge navigation tips that you can offer the transit agencies?
Another great question. We're a bit spoiled and lucky. We do operate LRT, which gives us a bit of a leg up on the skills, some of the skills to support electric buses. We would then try to leverage back and forth between our LRT operations and buses. And when we did the CNG, we looked at technologies that 80% of the bus was the same, and it was just a fueling system that was different. So I think it takes that investment, and I think it's part of that conversion cost we talk about, to make sure that the facilities are ready, that the equipment is ready, and also that the people are ready. And how do we, I think it also offers them a bit of a leg up where they get to be certified in several different operations. It also helps a bit with retaining employees, because they have skills that likely our competitors, being some of the private sector truck operators, they're not going to have those opportunities. So I think it's twofold, but I think you need to have that investment in conversion.
Mm-hmm. That's great. I do have like a question, because you mentioned LRT, maybe a question related to rail transit services would be of interest here. So we were wondering about the previous discussions, or the promise and the offer of rail transit services between Calgary Banff and Calgary Edmonton. With the end of Greyhound services, what types of transit dialogues are underway to connect the regions or cities of Alberta that you have been part of? Is the province engaging Calgary Transit, Edmonton Transit, and Red Deer Transit on these types of long-term mobility planning efforts?
Indeed, they are. There's a couple applications that are active. I know there's a rail link between Calgary and Banff that is looking at a private sector model in order to provide that linkage, and that's underway, and we're trying to figure out how does that link in with the transit system. There's always been a lot of talk about high-speed rail between Edmonton and Calgary, and we're excited for the prospects, so long as when the folks who ride the high-speed rail can be mobile in the city that they land in. So we've always said we need to build the two up together, and it's a fairly complicated business model, high cost, as you can imagine, and I think there's people at work on that application of high-speed rail. On the link between Banff and Calgary, there's also a link up to the airport to try to provide that mobility link. So I think those are all working together, and I'm really liking how it's starting to be organic. We have private sector kind of moving into that space and saying, how can we play in here? How can the model work? Having the Federal Infrastructure Bank come into it as well. I think it creates very fertile soil for many people to be involved in the provision of public transit. And I think we play a role in order to provide that connectivity. But I think those discussions are in play, and we're just waiting to see how they come out.
Thank you so much, Doug. It is really great, and I do want to continue this discussion, but I think we are out of time at this point. I do want to thank you for sharing your insights and answering the questions that we had for you today. I didn't get to all the questions that our audience had, but I think we were able to address some of them at least. So thank you so much. Leaders like you are making it possible for Canadian transit systems to advance and move forward in the technology innovation, and I thank you for continuing to do that. So thanks once again. With that, I do want to close this particular session and pass it to my colleague, Adriana, who would be delivering the closing remarks. Over to you, Adriana.
Thank you very much, Parvati. And thanks so much, Doug, for that wonderful presentation and helping us close out with our closing keynote. So hi, everyone. My name is Adriana Shuyen. I'm the Digital Business Development Lead at Qtrek. And so to close out on day one of our conference, the conference theme of Getting to Zero encompassed a comprehensive range of mobility solutions, from battery electric, hydrogen fuel cell, renewable natural gas technologies, as well as connected and autonomous shuttles, all of which will be explored and unpacked through a series of keynotes, panels, and networking sessions and exhibits over these 3 days. We also launched our Gender Parity in Transit survey this morning. We have already had a great amount of support, which shows how we as an industry are committed to gender parity within Canadian transit. But if you have yet to complete it, we would greatly appreciate your insights. The link will be pasted in the chat once again if you have not yet received it, and please fill that out when you have the chance. So today's unique lineup of events would not have been possible without the tireless efforts of Qtrek's conference task force. Magali Franette, Daniel C., Melissa Haynes, and Grace Riley, thank you all for all your hard work and dedication. I would also like to thank our sponsors. And so on the screen here, we have our platinum sponsor, ABB, our exclusive sponsor, ABB, our 2 platinum sponsors, New Flyer and Ballard. We have our gold sponsors, Proterra, Zev Clean Power, and Hitachi ABB Power Grids. We also have our silver sponsors, Enbridge, Novabus, and Thales, and our bronze sponsor, Siemens. We also have our event supporter, BAE Systems, and our media sponsors, Driving.ca and Energy Media. So please join us for a networking session right after this at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. But before you go, I would like to pass it over to my colleague, Magali.
Thank you so much, Adriana. Bonjour tout le monde. Le thème de la conférence « Atteindre l'objectif zéro » ou « Getting to Zero » comprend une gamme complète de solutions de mobilité, comme par exemple les technologies de transport électrique à batterie, à pile à hydrogène, au gaz naturel et renouvelable, ainsi que les navettes autonomes connectées. Ces nouvelles solutions en transport en commun seront toutes traitées et décortiquées à travers une série de conférences d'honneur, de panels de discussion, de sessions de réseautage et d'expositions pendant cette grande conférence de 3 jours. Nous en avons déjà été témoins aujourd'hui. On vous attend pour la suite demain et vendredi. Et surtout, merci de nous faire confiance, merci d'être présents en grand nombre et de vous impliquer dans cette discussion qui est tellement importante. Finalement, merci à l'équipe qui travaille de près ou de loin dans l'organisation de la conférence. Puis je vous invite, vous le public, à vous joindre à nous pour un 5 à 7 réseautage à 18h, heure avancée de l'Est. Merci beaucoup, puis à bientôt. Over to you, Adriana.
Thank you, and thanks for everyone for attending day 1 of our Low Carbon Smart Mobility Technology Conference. We are excited to see you tomorrow or at our networking session tonight in a few minutes. So please join us with a drink, and merci.